recently I did a stream on prison architecture, and this video is a more focused video specifically on Eastern State Penitentiary. I have another video out that is specifically just on some architectural principles. I hope you enjoy. Please like and subscribe.
But as the Walnut Street Jail became seriously overcrowded, they planned to build a large prison, now a state prison.
This resulted in the construction of Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, which adopted the Quaker philosophy of punishment by solitary confinement.
Okay,
it later
so yeah.
became known as the Pennsylvania system.
So, go back here. So this is the Eastern State Penitentiary. So I kind of like pull a couple of websites. So this is where you can see what it looks like right nowadays. As it like cuts back to these different pieces of footage. I have to check down. I think in this one it has the floor, not the floor plan, but the site plan. So I'm gonna go down here. No, okay, it's not this one, but this is sort of like an overview. Pretty interesting. I'll go here. This is what I want to go settle. So this is like a photo of like what it looks like currently today. And I want to go, okay. Okay, in the decades following the American Revolution, a major intellectual export to come out of the newly formed United States was prison design and reform. By the early 19th century, the Pennsylvania system of justice had been developed, replacing corporal punishment with Quaker-inspired isolation and labor. Proponents believed that criminals who reflected deeply on their crimes by spending their days in 24 hours of silence would become genuinely penitent for their crimes and would, as a result, be reformed. But we all know, like, locking people away by themselves for, like, days and days and days, like, does severe mental harm to people. Go. Opened in 1829, Eastern State Penitentiary became quickly the archetype for this revolutionary system of justice. Equally notable for its architecture and mechanical advances, Eastern State served as the structural and ideological model for more than 300 prisons around the world. In architect John Haviland's radial design, subblocks of the okay, let me restart that again. My brain is just not wanting to work. You drink some water? Okay. From the top. Okay. In architect John Haviland's radial design, cell blocks of the prison extend outward from a central surveillance area. In the block were prisoners' private cells, each with a adjacent outdoor exercise yard enclosed by a 10-foot wall. Prisoner cells were equipped with central heat, running water, flushing toilets, and skylights, at a time when such innovations were rarely available in homes, let alone prisons. Now we go down here. I'm trying to remember. So this is some photos of what the interior looks like now. But I actually want to new tab. Show off this. So this is basically the center, and then each of these branches branch off from here. And there are some extra side buildings, I believe. This one. Okay, there. Oop. I think it was side buildings, or I'm remembering something different. Maybe I remember something different, but like, this is huge, and we'll find out that this prison design as well didn't work for a very specific reason. So we're gonna go back to Mom Marvels, and they're gonna give us a little 411.
Eastern was a radical departure in prison architecture. This floor plan shows its radial cell block design.
So the design was set up in this hub and spoke manner.
So you see like that? It's like hub and spoke, but more like kind of like the Panopticon, but like more like what the older gentleman sorry. In the first video we watched where the older gentleman was talking about previous designs, this is more like the guard has to now travel all the way down back and forth to see everyone in their cell. There is going to be more manpower you need to have people like constantly patrolling than if you were to have them like more facing the center where you can see everybody.
In order to improve supervision of the inmates and thereby prevent escapes.
The philosophy behind Eastern was to keep the inmates separate from each other, to prevent them from forming gangs and organizing riots or escapes. When a prisoner first arrived, he was escorted to his cell with a hood over his head.
This is fucking crazy. I'm not gonna lie, when I heard that, I'm like, excuse me? Why would you do that? You take him to an execution?
Could not see the other prisoners or where he was going, and they in turn could not see him.
The prison was designed in the way it was to ensure that the prison could carry out its philosophy of solitary confinement for all of the inmates.
By 1820 standards, Eastern was massive, with nearly 11 acres inside its walls. The outside wall was 1/2 mile around and 8 feet thick at the base. Eastern was one of the first prisons to build towers. The front building was 200 feet long, with a square tower turret at each end. It also had a guard tower on the roof of its central rotunda.
The cells were quite large enough that an inmate would not only have his living space, but also room for a workbench, a loom, machinery, tools, raw materials, whatever he needed in order to do his assigned work, which could be everything from...
So even back then, there was like a focus on like having prisoners basically be like labor, essentially labor for the state. Yeah. There is a, I don't know if I particularly time-stamped it here, but there was a discussion on whether the prison is surrounded by walls or it's more open, really like denotes like its view on like criminals and rehabilitation. Like the higher the walls or the more thickness of the wall, not thickness of the walls, but like when there's a separation between like them and the rest of society, it shows you how society views criminals.
Weaving or dyeing cloth, making shoes, caning chairs, things of this nature. It all was done in the individual cell.
But the hub and spoke architecture of Eastern Penitentiary had many design flaws.
Okay, here we go, the design flaws.
It was expensive to design, build, and operate a prison of this kind because the rooms, the individual cells had to be so large. And also because having the inmates by themselves, working by themselves, they could not take advantage of the techniques of factory production. So there was less opportunity to make money for the inmates to produce revenue for the institution. So
it's basically giving them like a bit of comfort with the space in their rooms was detrimental to the amount of people that get stuff. Like, so like, oh, it's a bit quiet.
29, so we see copies of Eastern State all over the globe, making this arguably history's most influential prison. I'd say when I first started here that most people were here for the dark tourism side of things, to hear about escapes and Al Capone and, you know, Silver Era gangsters, things like that. But I've really seen a change in our visitors, especially in the last 5 years. I'd say there's a lot of people coming here to learn about criminal justice reform, social justice, to hold discussions and dialogues about really the shortcomings of our criminal justice system. So we're really trying, again, to connect the past with the present here and learn something from the legacy of America's most historic prison. I would define dark tourism as a site or institution whose history or content or subject matter has to do with something morbid: pain, suffering, trauma, death, dying, these kinds of things. Eastern State's often known as the world's first true penitentiary, and what that means is a building designed to inspire regret. And a big part of how the prison officials did that was, again, through architecture. The outside of the building resembles a Gothic castle. It's scary, it's intimidating.
So,
it's what we would call...
I didn't go over this specifically. From the Modern Marvels video, they talked about how old castles were also used as prisons. Like old derelict castles were used as prisons. Another thing that they use is prisons, like in America as well, but it's not. They're decommissioned right now, but they can be brought back. Is boats. Boats will be used as prisons for citizens if there was an overflow.
A deterrent. But on the inside, visitors to Eastern State are often surprised to see that the cell blocks resemble a cathedral or a church. And the idea was that if a prison looked like a cathedral or a church, people would be more likely to think about what they had done wrong, to reflect, and to seek penitence or true remorse. And that becomes the root of the word penitentiary. People are really fascinated in penitentiaries. Alcatraz is one of the most visited national parks in the National Park Service. I think that's
I have been to Alcatraz. It's okay. Just don't go like during September, October, because there's a shit ton of flies. They'll just like harass you. It's very upsetting.
Because despite the size of the American prison system, the scope of mass incarceration, most Americans will never go inside of a prison, active or historic. We really go out of our way to engage our visitors in a dialogue and ask them to examine their relationship to the criminal justice system.
Oh, hi, Pimenta.
Really to spark a conversation that we hope.
So, Pimenta, right now we are to give like the law of the stuff I talked about. You'll have to watch the beginning. But right now we are looking at Eastern State Penitentiary, which is one of the first like penitentiaries which was in America, and it's very influential. Oh my god, influential. Oh my god, I can't speak.
After the museum exhibit visit is done, we have an annual haunted house fundraiser that goes through the prison called Terror Behind the Walls, and it's one of the biggest haunted houses in the United States, one of the highest rated haunted houses in the country, and it pays our bills, really. So we use it to stabilize this National Historic Landmark, to fund daytime public programming.
So this one is... I have not got a chance to look at this, so hopefully it's interesting. I'm excited for it. Hey, Chucklehead.
The now empty Eastern State Penitentiary is a haunting relic looming over the city skyline as a grim testament
so I want to see what the central
past.
Part
Within these
like.
walls, the state employed such peculiar and harrowing methods of punishment that I wouldn't even be allowed to describe them on YouTube. And yet, surprisingly, this formidable institution was once considered a pioneer in reform. The history runs deep here, from Al Capone's designer cell to forgotten escape tunnels. So join us to find out what remains. This is the story of the Eastern State Penitentiary. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History.
I think I have some photos still I can share.
Let's start in colonial times, when jails and prisons were raunchy and corrupt businesses. You see, back then, many were commercial ventures filled with working girls, corrupt officials, chaos.
Oh, that's another thing. So, back in the day, women and men actually kind of stayed in the same prison, but like women were usually kept like further away from the men. It wasn't until like I believe can't remember her name, like a lady was like, "Hey, I believe women crime doers can be reformed. They should get their own prison all to themselves, away from the men who will cause them to sin."
And a little bit of alcohol for good measure. They were nothing more than holding pens for any sort of undesirables, holding normal people alongside petty criminals and violent offenders. Conditions were so bad that starvation, cold, disease, and violence often killed prisoners before they were even sentenced. In the 1700s, capital punishment was by far most common for serious crimes committed in the colonies. Retribution, also known as corporal punishment, was also common. This entailed physically injuring someone as a consequence of wrongdoing, which included flogging, maiming, branding, and even blinding. Flogging meant punishing a criminal with a whip or rod. Okay. Maiming was the forcible removal of extremities, and branding often involved a hot iron with a letter or symbol identifying a person's crime. Another form of punishment was the stocks or pillory, which restrained a prisoner as the crowd mocked and hurled stones or...
That's funny. I believe this image was used in the Modern Marvels video we were watching, if I remember correctly.
Rotten food at them. These measures were reserved for less serious crimes in the colonies, such as dishonest trading or public intoxication. The stocks held you by the feet and forced you to sit up and face the stoning, while the pillory forced your head and hands into a wooden or metal frame, causing you to bend over for anywhere from half an hour to an entire day. It was a painful and humiliating experience. With that in mind, that's why it's no wonder that people began to question the nature of prisons and what was going on inside. Once the United States had secured their freedom in 1783, the Philadelphia citizens, led by Dr. Benjamin Rush, among others, began to reform the harsh penal code of 1718.
So Benjamin Rush was the creator of the Eastern State Penitentiary.
The new code replaced severe punishment with public labor, while they began to take a closer look at the conditions of the Walnut Street Jail. Built in 1776 to relieve the overcrowding and disreputable conditions at Philadelphia's Old Stone Jail, Walnut Street Jail wasn't much of an improvement. Its disgraceful conditions, coupled with the public's reaction to convicts working in the streets, led to the creation of the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisoners, whose goal it was to correct issues in prisons which didn't take into consideration the age, gender, or nature of the crime for its prisoners. It was founded by Dr. Benjamin Rush in 1787 and was one of the first prison reform groups in the world, with Benjamin Franklin joining soon thereafter. Conception of the Eastern State was upon its creation. The group began looking into Walnut Street Jail and were shocked by the poor conditions, and so they presented an account of their investigations to the state legislature a year later, recommending solitary confinement and hard labor as an effective reformation strategy. This is because they thought being alone with your thoughts would give you time to reflect on your actions and therefore reform. So in 1790, 16 single cells were built.
We did talk earlier about how solitary confinement doesn't really help people and is like a detriment to people, because humans are social creatures, and then locking a person away by themselves to their thoughts is not really helpful. It's not very helpful for them.
In Walnut Street Jail to test the effectiveness of day and night solitary confinement, but that was only the beginning. After many years of lobbying, the Philadelphia Society received funding from the Pennsylvania legislature to build a new prison in 1821. What came to be known as Eastern State would be a new type of prison, featuring solitary confinement for all of its 250 prisoners, a measure that officials of the time believed encouraged penance, and what most would argue was the world's first major penitentiary. When Eastern State Penitentiary was constructed, it was one of the most expensive prisons ever made, with a price around $780,000.
And we found out the reason it was so expensive is because of the sheer size of each cell block. At least that's what I picked up. He probably may have something different, maybe, but we were looking at a different website that was kind of give some information in regard to it, and this is one of the floor plans for it. And so I go back here. I kind of this is more a simplified view of it. Let's see. Okay, so 1966 became a monument. Okay. So this is a sky view of it. And then we're gonna go over here. We have some footage for us to look at, because I peeked at this before, but I was like, why not?
And is considered to be the first modern prison. The design of the penitentiary was decided by competition, with multiple architects submitting designs to be considered. In the end, John Haviland's won out. He was a British architect who had settled in Philadelphia and beat his rival, William Strickland, winning the
Haviland is the
$100 prize in the process. Construction began in 1821, and Strickland was chosen to oversee the project, but fired just a year later and replaced by his competitor. When Eastern State was conceived, solitary confinement didn't really exist as a concept. It hadn't been instituted in most prisons before, so this would be the first time to institute it in full force. The idea was to make prisoners feel truly alone, in order to repent for their crimes. To this end, the prison was designated with 250 prisoners in mind, each with their own cell for the entirety of their sentence. The entrance to each cell was a small door that forced prisoners to bow when entering or exiting the cell, as if to a higher power, encouraging a penitent attitude. This was reinforced by vaulted ceilings and skylights, which the architect claimed let God's light and wisdom shine down upon them. To prevent inmates from seeing guards or other prisoners, cells had so-called feed doors and personal exercise yards, and in a time when even the White House had no indoor plumbing, Eastern State had faucets and flushing toilets. The penitentiary had no cooling system, but in the winter, hot water was piped through the prison to provide brief relief from the cold.
Yeah, they had
The prison was designed in a wagon wheel layout. 7 single-story cell blocks extended circularly around a central point, giving guards a clear line of sight virtually anywhere in the prison at any time. 2 cell blocks were completed before Eastern State opened in 1829, less than a week shy of Halloween. In 1831, Cell Block 3, the last of the original single-story cell blocks, was completed. From this point forward, cell blocks were built with 2 stories or more, as more and more people were incarcerated there. Cell blocks 4 through 7 were all built with 2 stories and were completed in 1835. In all, the prison covers 11 acres.
Yeah. Is we give them too much privacy or no privacy. So I know when I was reading on Michel Foucault talked a bit about it, and it's like the panopticon isn't just for like the jailers towards prisoners, it's also prisoners for each other because they're also watching each other as well.
With 450 heated cells, not to mention state-of-the-art plumbing and sewage systems. It was a technological and architectural marvel. But even after the prison's creation, all was not well. In 1877, 4 new cell blocks needed to be built, this time without exercise yards, since they utilized space between existing cell blocks. However, after this, yet more space was needed. In 1911, cell block 12 was built between cell blocks 6 and 7, made of reinforced concrete and having 3 stories.
Okay, so this explains this specific design, where you can tell like more, like you can tell like they're trying to fit like a square peg into a round hole sort of situation. They're trying to like compensate for like they didn't prepare for they didn't expect her to be like expansion, I guess I can assume. That's probably like a lack of foresight, if I can assume that he's going to talk about.
40 cells each. 12 had no arched ceilings or skylights, only narrow windows in each cell. Cell block 13 was opened between 1909 and 1926. Little is known about its early use, but one fact is clear. This was the block where most punishments were dealt. Known as the Hole, or the Klondike, it housed 10 dark, poorly ventilated cells with iron beds and barely enough room to breathe. Cells were about half the size of those found in normal prisons, often limiting the ability to stand, treatment that would constitute extreme cruelty by today's standards. The last block built was cell block 14 in 1926, a 3-story building that completely eliminated the last of these spaces between any other blocks. And it needs to be pointed out that a prison meant to hold 250 prisoners was now packed with 1,700, putting prisoners in a precarious situation, to say the least.
So we went from 250 to like over 1,000. So I don't know. It's probably the one he showed was like the original plan, and this is just what came after. So like, I can assume these dark spots are the original, and then everything else is what it was added on. Excuse me. It also could be because this is, at least from what I can tell, a single story. That could have also been the issue as well, because if they had built it for multiple stories, it would have probably done a lot better in the long run. But they just built it for single story. Back here.
Perhaps it would be prudent to point out that if you find yourself in that situation, or any other unjust situation for that matter, you might want to seek legal help immediately. Check out our sponsor, Morgan & Morgan, America's largest injury. Saw many changes. 9 on your phone. Thank you, Morgan & Morgan, for supporting the channel.
Morgan.
Now, back to the Eastern State
Penitentiary. I don't need you right now.
Throughout the years, the compound saw many changes. On top of, or rather inside, new cell blocks, staff and prisoners alike have modified the facility to their needs. One of the first changes to Eastern State was Warden Michael Cassidy's impressive office space. He built the office for his work in the 1880s, but later wardens moved their offices into the administration building. This gave way for the religious staff, the Protestant, Jewish, and Catholic chaplains to move in. Another religious space constructed in the penitentiary was the Eastern State Synagogue, perhaps the first of its kind in an American prison. Built in 1924, the synagogue featured dark wooden benches, an ark reader's table, an ornate plaster Star of David, and an eternal flame. It remained a staple of Eastern State's religious community for the duration of the prison's use. You would almost think that the penitentiary, with its spiritual outlook and divinity-inspired architecture, would be effective in reforming its prisoners with religion. Eastern State was home to all manner of prisoners, most notably the Chicago gangster Al Capone and the infamous bank robber Willie Sutton. On May the 17th, 1929, Al Capone, Scarface himself, was returning from a trip to Atlantic City when his journey was cut short. Capone was arrested outside a Philadelphia movie theater for carrying an illegally concealed and unlicensed .38 revolver. Philadelphia courts were tough and gave him the maximum sentence of 1 year in prison. Capone was sent to Eastern State to serve out his sentence, but while the courts wanted to make an example of him, the prison treated him as an esteemed guest. Philadelphia newspapers reported that Capone's cell had lavish furniture, beautiful rugs, tasteful oil paintings, and a radio that he used to listen to waltzes.
Okay. I remember this. I remember, apparently Al Capone, like, lived in, like, the lap of luxury.
This high-class treatment. Capone was not all that eager to get out of the clink. You see, his arrest lined up perfectly with the rise of mob violence in Chicago, and hence many accused him of actually hiding in prison on purpose. The mob boss denied these rumors and spent thousands of dollars trying to get himself released, but with no results. In the end, he was released after 9 months on good behavior on March the 17th, 1930. Willie Sutton is a different story, also known as Slick Willie, Willie the Actor, and the Gentleman Bandit. Sutton spent his early adulthood robbing banks, using disguises and charm, but he wasn't always successful and would get arrested multiple times throughout his career. One of his arrests was in 1934 for the brazen machine gun robbery of the Corn Exchange Bank in Philly. Luckily, he was an accomplished escape artist too, attempting at least 5 escapes during his time at Eastern State Penitentiary.
That is one thing I did wonder is not an issue with a constant thing that was brought up with like prisons is the possibility that someone may be like escape is what's the word I'm looking for? My brain. So when they were talking about previous prisons like Alcatraz, what was it? I'm sorry. I'm trying to remember something, but like there is an issue with like no matter how like much tech finger quotes they put into the prison to prevent people from escaping, you have basically like a whole mass of people who have all the free time in the world to think up how to get around the system that you placed. Like, Pippi, please, I love you. Please let me finish my thoughts so I don't lose it. Like, there was one prison where basically 3 people just walked out the front door just by like just putting on different clothes and like leaving with like a tour group.
One of these escape attempts in his 1953 autobiography, Where the Money Was, where he takes credit as the mastermind behind the operation. But in reality, this escape plan was the work of 12 men led by a prisoner named Clarence Klindus, or Clinny. Clinny was a plasterer, stonemason, burglar, and forger who also had a reputation as a top-notch scavenger. Sutton himself said, quote, "If you gave Clinny 2 weeks, he could get you Ava Gardner, a famous movie actress from the time." He continues, "If you gave Clinny a year, he could get you out of prison." So it was him who came up with the idea to dig a tunnel out of Eastern State Penitentiary. Almost as if out of a movie, the crew of 12 men dug a tunnel from cell 68 using spoons and...
So that's also that's benefit for the justice system, but like one of the finger quotes benefits of prefabbed cells is that you can avoid this by like having the cell reinforced. So this I assume is that actually I'll let him go and describe exactly what material they dug through before I like make an assumption.
And flattened cans as shovels. In 2-man teams of 30-minute shifts, the crew slowly dug an opening through the wall and into the ground, hiding the dirt in their pockets and scattering that dirt throughout the yard.
Okay. So they specifically had dug through dirt, where like a prefab will be like concrete or steel or rebar, enforced concrete. So this is Shawshank Redemption.
Amazingly, the entrance to...
It's been a hot minute since I've seen Shawshank Redemption, so I that realization like went over my head.
The tunnel escaped inspection several times, thanks to a false panel treated by Clinny to match the plaster of the cell walls. The tunnel was also reinforced with scaffolding and illuminated as a true feat of engineering. The prisoners made a system to deposit their waste and prevent noxious fumes from escaping their tunnel when it reached the prison sewer line. After months of toil, the tunnel was 38 inches wide and stretched 100 feet beyond the walls of the prison. The prisoners were ready to escape. On the morning of April the 3rd, 1945, the 12 men snuck away to cell 68 on their way to breakfast. and from there, they quickly disappeared into the tunnel. Half of the escapees were caught by the end of the day, with the rest being caught within a couple of months. 2 escapees, including Sutton, were caught within 3 minutes of freedom and were sent to the cramped, dark Klondikes. Clinty himself only made it 3 hours before being caught. In the end, their escape was a failure. Months of work focused on one moment boiled down.
My thing is, like, how did they get caught? Was it just, like, were they being stupid? Like, was it just that their faces were known? Because it's like back in those days, like, it says you don't have the internet. You have, like, newspaper. Or they just, because of their outfits, because they said in Modern Marvel, specifically the prison outfit is just made to, like, make it harder for prisoners to escape. But I don't know.
Down to a flash in the pan and the capture of all who were involved. After the tunnel was found, guards filled it with ash and covered it with cement.
Maybe the real treasure was poo we crawled through along the way.
It wasn't all for nothing. For his part, Sutton was transferred to the escape-proof Holmesburg prison, which surprisingly to everyone, he promptly escaped from. He evaded the law for years, while his story inspired every inmate who came after him. To this day, it's the most famous escape in Eastern State history, and no doubt inspired all manner of prison-based pop culture, down to digging a tunnel with a spoon used for public perception. After Eastern State Penitentiary's creation, it quickly became the most copied building in the United States. And the same solitary confinement practices were adopted by more than 300 prisons worldwide.
This right here, I can assume is the original design. Oh, look at here. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. Okay, so yes, you see these get added in. Then you have here, which is, I assume, is the entrance to here. Okay.
Spurred by its
it's
unique
kind of
design.
like when in architecture school or classes, when you are trying to come up with a design, like you're trying to pinpoint what you want to do with, like, a piece of architecture, like you want to do an auditorium or a library. You always want to take from pre-existing buildings. It's like you're sort of like a inspiration, is a sense. So called precedents, where you take another building and you break it down, like what works about it, what does not work about it, what's the history of it, what's the context that it was built in, what's the material that it's made of, and you kind of break that down so you then can improve your building as well as take, like, inspiration from other buildings. Usually you would need about 3 precedents, and you need to make sure that you provide, like, a good explanation, justification for why you chose these precedents and how they impact your design. By the way, Shawshank was originally a Stephen King story. Yeah, I know Stephen King wrote it. I remember, like, Stephen King telling some stories where, like, a woman says, "Oh, I hate Stephen King's, like, stories. They're so scary." And then she goes like, "But I really like the Shawshank Redemption." And it's like, oh man. I don't know if this is true, but I heard this. Like, there was, like, thanks to, like, Shawshank Redemption became, like, a more empathetic overall view of prisoners in media. But I don't know how true that is. I heard it before, but I would have to, like, fact check where I heard that.
Tourists flocked to Philadelphia and toured the prison in the 1830s and 40s. Charles Dickinson was one of these visitors, but after seeing the poor conditions and talking to prisoners whose minds were fragile and weak, he came away appalled and wrote that solitary confinement was, quote, torturing of the mind that is much worse than any other physical punishment that can be administered. He was not the only one who held the sentiment. A series of investigations into the Eastern State's finances, punishment practices, and deviations from the Pennsylvania system have been going on for years. Solitary confinement was officially abandoned in 1913, but truthfully, the system had broken down decades before. Now cells were shared by 2 to 3 prisoners, but this only gave the penitentiary the chance to carry out its punishment in new ways. In the 1920s and 30s, Warden Hubert Hardboil Smith, as they called him, ruled over the prison with an iron fist. During his
warden of the Eastern Penitentiary, who was praised yesterday by Dr. J. Evans Skeely, State Secretary of Welfare, for his administrative work at Cherry Hill, 21st Street, and Fairmount Avenue.
His reign, prisoners rioted and set fire to their cells over low wages, overcrowding, and a lack of recreational facilities. But every riot was put down with a strong show of force. This was also the time when the Klondikes were starting to be used again. Eastern State became a place prisoners were only sent if the state believed that they needed Smith's brutal reform tactics. So how did this prison, which inspired hundreds across the globe, ultimately fall apart? Well, the answer lies in Eastern State's creation. The Pennsylvania prison system, also known as the separate system, became too costly to maintain. It required prisoners to feel completely isolated from the moment they walked in. Each prisoner had their own cell, their own exercise yard, food had to be delivered individually through feed doors, and exercise times had to be carefully scheduled to prevent neighboring inmates from interacting.
Yeah, so, like, one issue with this prison that is very obvious when we looked at other ones is that there is you are locked to your cell and you are basically kept away from everybody, but it also makes it harder for everyone else. There's more labor that needs to be done because you are separated from everyone else. So normally prisons you would go to a chow hall to eat, but since they don't have that, and they have 1,000 prisoners in a place that should only hold 250. You have to double, triple, quadruple your efforts to get everyone fed at the exact same time during the day.
One another. Critics also protested against the negative effects of solitary confinement, which we now know were worse than they could have ever imagined. Within the prison, prisoners weren't just isolated. It felt as if no one else even existed. They did everything alone, from eating to bathing. And in the process, they weren't even allowed to speak to themselves. They were drowning in utter silence, with guards wearing felt covers on their shoes to reduce the noise they made. And when they did leave the cell, a hood was frequently put over their head so they couldn't see any other human being. It was psychological torture at its finest. Although it could be argued that the Philadelphia Society meant well, modern science tells us that the use of solitary confinement is one of the worst possible punishments that they could carry out. Humans are social creatures, and it's widely agreed that we have a fundamental need for connection. Even as far back as 50 years ago, research linked social isolation and sensory deprivation with slowed brain activity. 1 week in solitary could lead to significant changes in the brain, resulting in damage to learning, memory, and awareness, qualities that were most often just exchanged for highlighted anxiety and fear. Research also shows that social deprivation can cause people to experience social pain, which the brain processes the same way as physical pain. And with that in mind, if prisoners had existing mental illnesses, which they are likely to have had, then solitary confinement only made them worse. In fact, it can also lead to prisoners developing new mental illnesses, such as anxiety, depression, insomnia, PTSD, paranoia, and psychosis. Prisoners in solitary confinement are 3 times more likely to have hypertension, 3 times more likely to hurt themselves, and 5 times more likely to end their lives. So, for many valid reasons, the Pennsylvania system was abandoned. In its place came the Auburn system, which was inspired by the Philadelphia Society. Originating in 1819 in Auburn, New York, this system had prisoners eat and work together, but not speak during these activities. The system also believed the prisoners had the potential to corrupt each other if they had too much contact, so they were held in solitary confinement cells at night. But with the loss of one punishment came the rise of many others. Whenever a prisoner stepped out of line or even spoke, they were met with lashing by a leather strap, the water bath, the hole, or the mad chair. The lashings are self-explanatory, and we've already covered the hole, also known as the Klondikes, but the other punishments require a little more detail. The water bath involved dunking a prisoner in ice-cold bath water and then hanging them out to dry overnight. The cruelest guards would save this punishment for the winter when the water froze on the prisoner's skin. For the mad chair, prisoners were tightly strapped to a chair for hours or sometimes days before being released. Their movement and circulation was restricted for so long that prisoners spent days recovering from the punishment, often unable to walk. Some prisoners even lost their limbs to amputation when the circulation didn't return. With that being said, Eastern State Penitentiary was a truly awful place, with many prisoners ending their lives to escape punishment in one form or another. And it's no wonder that the Pennsylvania legislature recommended abandoning the penitentiary in 1945, followed by investigations lasting until 1959. But what happened next all but sealed the prison's fate. In 1961, John Clausenberg tricked a guard into opening the cell of another prisoner, Manuel Magendral. Together, they overpowered the guard and started the largest riot in the prison's history. Several hours later, a large force of policemen, guards, and state troopers were assembled to reclaim the prison. They regained control, but the riots fueled more discussion about Eastern State's closure. Almost as if to sign a death warrant, the federal government designated the penitentiary a National Historic Landmark in 1965, before it finally closed down permanently just 5 years later. Most of the prisoners were sent to the state correctional...
Okay. World Monument Watch. Okay, over time, the Pennsylvania system was criticized for its reliance on extreme solitary confinement. Eastern State gradually moved to a congregate system, officially discontinued use of the Pennsylvania system in 1913. In 1971, the penitentiary closed. Potential development of the site in the late 1980s spurred local and state preservation efforts. Okay. Limit tours of the site began in 1988, and this prison opened for its first full season of regular tours in 1994. The site was included on the World Monuments Watch in 1996 to highlight the preservation effort that had begun and to call attention to the need for resource and extensive conservation at the historic site. Okay.
Institution at Gradeford. But funny enough, the building housed more prisoners from the Holmesburg County Prison after a riot there. Eastern State Penitentiary formally closed its doors in 1971, but its building remains in Philadelphia as a very haunting scar. After Eastern State Penitentiary closed and all the remaining prisoners had been moved out, the city of Philadelphia purchased the building for $400,000. They thought it could be renovated and transformed into anything from an apartment complex to a mall, but instead it sat and collected dust for decades. Hence, the Philadelphia Streets Department used the penitentiary grounds for storage, and the last city caretaker, Dan McLeod, fed the colony of stray cats that took up residence in the empty halls. Vandals smashed skylights and windows.
Okay, you can't mention a colony of cats and then not have any photos. That's blasphemy, sir.
While an urban forest grew in its halls and cells.
Yes,
it wasn't until 1988 that the Eastern State Task Force was formed, made up of architects, preservationists, and historians. They convinced the city to preserve the prison, rather than turn it into something else. Mayor Wilson Goode urged the Redevelopment Authority to reject all proposals for commercial use of the property, and limited tours started later that year. At first, tourists needed to wear hard hats to tour the crumbling prison, but after extensive stabilization efforts that began in 1991, tourists no longer needed one. The first of its popular Halloween fundraisers also started this year, allowing visitors to tour the prison as a haunted house. The Terror Behind the Walls event had been held every year since. Eastern State Penitentiary opened for daily historic tours in 1994, receiving 10,000 visitors in its first year, which notably is more than the original prison had since 1858. In 1996, permanent museum exhibits were constructed and a marketing campaign for the prison began. And then finally, mass popularity came when Eastern State was featured in the Bruce Willis movie, 12 Monkeys. In 1998, Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site Incorporated was formed, a nonprofit organization dedicated...
I'm just like, oh. But that's pretty cool. I have not seen 12 Monkeys. That's neat when like a location you're looking at is like using film. Yeah, I'll get to you soon, Stormy. I promise. She's moving. She's moved beside me to in front of the monitor.
To preserving, interpreting, and teaching the history of the infamous prison. Then, in 2003, to celebrate the 10th season of public tours, the Voice of Eastern State audio tour was introduced. Upon entering the prison, you are provided with an MP3 player and headphones that will guide you through the prison.
It's like, I think like what would have like helped their like confinement thing is they were like giving like some like if they're like, oh, you're gonna be by yourself, they should give them like a companion of sorts, so they're not completely alone. But like, I don't think you should fucking use solitary confinement anyways.
Its history. The 30-minute audio tour, narrated by actor Steve Buscemi, instructs you on where to turn.
What? Oh my! I need to go here. Okay, you have me at Steve Buscemi gives me an audio tour.
Turn and what to look at while in the prison. The tour takes you past many cells and is frequently interrupted by stories of former wardens, guards, and even prisoners. There are also stops for subjects like escapes, sports, sexuality, race, and more. To make the venue feel more authentic, Other parts have been restored. The penitentiary synagogue, which was used continuously until the prison closed, fell into disrepair during abandonment. But when the building was being preserved, it was the first truly restored space, returning to its appearance. In 2005, marking the 60th anniversary of Clinny and Sutton's escape, the Eastern State nonprofit conducted a series of architectural surveys to find their tunnel. Using a ground-penetrating radar, they scanned the estimated location of the tunnel until they found a part that hadn't collapsed or been filled in by the guards. A rover was sent in to see what remains of the scaffolding and lighting, but no major discoveries were made. Still, the curiosity about this famed tunnel caused the public's interest in Eastern State to be newly ignited. Today, Eastern State Penitentiary is open 12 months a year and 7 days a week. Other than Halloween, it has special events year-round, such as the Winter Adventure Tours, prison uprisings, and Bastille Day celebrations. The Philadelphia Society, which created Eastern State and in turn the modern prison, survives today as the Pennsylvania Prison Society, promoting correctional reform and social justice. Over its dreadful years as a prison, Eastern State has built up a reputation of being one of the most haunted places in the country.
I want to thank everyone for stopping by. So that's the end of my first attempt to like do like a stream on architecture.